The year was 1987, and Miami was a city drunk on its own excess.
Neon lights painted South Beach in electric blues and pinks, casting shadows where fortunes were made and lost before the San Rose over Biscayne Bay.
I was 25 years old, driving a white Lamborghini Countach down Ocean Drive, with enough cocaine in my penthouse apartment to supply half of Florida, and more money than I knew how to count. My name was Marcus King Rodriguez, and I was living what I thought was the American dream, Miami Vice style. The transformation from street kid to drug kingpin happened faster than a speedboat racing across the Everglades at midnight. I grew up in Overtown, where crack vials crunched under your sneakers like broken glass, and where mothers locked their children inside apartments that felt more like prison cells than homes. My father disappeared when I was 7, leaving behind only empty beer bottles and bruises on my mother's arms. By 15, I was running product for older dealers who saw potential in a smart kid with nothing to lose and everything to prove. But I wasn't content to stay small-time. While other dealers fought over street corners in Liberty City, I studied the real players, the Colombians who flew their private jets into Opa-locka Airport, the Cubans who controlled the ports, the Haitians who had connections throughout the Caribbean. I learned to speak Spanish fluently, picked up enough Portuguese to deal with Brazilian suppliers, and most importantly, I learned that in the drug business, respect and fear were currencies more valuable than cash itself. My breakthrough came through a connection I made at a nightclub in Coconut Grove. Isabella Moreno was the daughter of a Colombian cartel lieutenant, beautiful enough to stop traffic on the MacArthur Causeway, and smart enough to see opportunity where others saw only risk. She introduced me to her father's organization, not as muscle or a street dealer, but as someone who understood the American market in ways they never could. I spoke the language, knew the culture, and most importantly, I was hungry enough to take risks that established players wouldn't dare attempt. Within 2 years, I controlled distribution networks that stretched from Key West to Jacksonville, with satellite operations in Tampa, Orlando, and the Gulf Coast. My organization moved product through legitimate businesses, construction companies that built condos in Aventura, shipping companies with warehouses in Hialeah, restaurants in Little Havana that served more than just authentic Cuban cuisine. We laundered money through real estate investments that helped fuel Miami's booming development, turning drug profits into gleaming skyscrapers that pierced the Florida sky like glass needles. The lifestyle was intoxicating in ways that had nothing to do with the product we sold. Penthouse parties that lasted until dawn, with models, musicians, and politicians who knew better than to ask too many questions about the source of my wealth. Speedboats that could outrun Coast Guard cutters, flying low across the turquoise waters of Florida Bay toward the Bahamas where offshore accounts waited like electronic safety nets. Designer suits from boutiques in Bal Harbour, watches that cost more than most people's houses, and a reputation that opened doors throughout South Florida's elite social circles. But success in the drug business is measured in more than money. It's measured in survival. Every dollar earned came with the constant awareness that death or imprisonment waited around every corner. I slept with a loaded .45 under my pillow in a bedroom with bulletproof windows overlooking the Miami skyline. My daily routine included counter-surveillance drives through Coral Gables, coded phone conversations that changed location every few hours, and the exhausting paranoia of never knowing which friend might become tomorrow's informant. The American dream I thought I was living was actually a nightmare dressed in designer clothes, and I was too intoxicated by power to realize I was slowly destroying everything I touched, including my own soul. By 1989, my operation had evolved into something that resembled a Fortune 500 company more than a street gang. We operated out of a legitimate import-export business in Doral, complete with corporate offices, secretaries who had no idea what they were really facilitating, and accountants who specialized in creative bookkeeping. Our fleet of trucks moved legitimate cargo alongside hidden compartments filled with product from Colombia, and our warehouse workers in Medley handled inventory that would have supplied half the nightclubs on South Beach for months. The money flowed like a river during flood season. On an average week, we generated more cash than most small towns saw in annual tax revenue. Counting it became a logistical challenge that required teams of people working in shifts, sorting bills by denomination in safe houses scattered throughout Miami-Dade County. We bought counting machines that banks used, industrial-grade safes that required combinations known only to my most trusted lieutenants, and storage facilities in Kendall where stacks of currency sat like green monuments to American excess. My personal fleet included vehicles for every occasion and security need. The Lamborghini for making impressions, a bulletproof Mercedes for business meetings, speedboats docked at marinas in Key Biscayne for quick escapes, and even a small Cessna kept at a private airstrip in Homestead for emergency flights to non-extradition countries. Each vehicle was equipped with communication equipment that could reach any part of South Florida, and my drivers were former military personnel who understood that their primary job was keeping me alive, not comfortable. The corruption network I built was perhaps more impressive than the drug operation itself. Police officers in Miami Beach who provided advance warning of raids, judges in downtown Miami whose gambling debts made them surprisingly flexible in their interpretation of evidence, port officials who developed selective blindness when certain shipping containers arrived from Cartagena. I learned that in Miami, everything and everyone had a price. The challenge was simply figuring out the correct currency, whether that was cash, cocaine, or the more subtle coin of mutual assured destruction. My social circle expanded to include people I would never have imagined knowing as a kid in Overtown. Real estate developers who helped launder money through luxury condo projects in Aventura and Sunny Isles Beach. Bankers who facilitated offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Even entertainment industry figures who appreciated the lifestyle my money could provide and asked no questions about its source. We attended charity galas at the Fontainebleau Hotel, rubbed shoulders with celebrities at exclusive clubs in South Beach, and I donated generously to political campaigns throughout Florida, buying influence like any other commodity. The violence, when it came, was swift and decisive. Competitors who tried to muscle into our territory disappeared into the Everglades, their bodies feeding alligators that asked no questions about jurisdiction or justice. Informants were dealt with using methods that sent clear messages to others who might be tempted to cooperate with law enforcement. I employed specialists from various backgrounds, former military contractors, Cuban exiles with scores to settle, Colombian sicarios who treated killing like a craft they'd spent years perfecting. But the most insidious corruption was what the lifestyle did to my own moral compass. I told myself I was just a businessman operating in a market that happened to be illegal, that I was providing a service to willing customers, that the violence was just an unfortunate cost of doing business in a competitive industry. I donated money to community centers in Overtown, telling myself this balanced the scales somehow. I employed dozens of people in legitimate businesses, convincing myself I was a job creator rather than a destroyer of lives. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain these rationalizations was exhausting, but the alternative, facing the reality of what I had become, seemed impossible to contemplate. The early 1990s were the apex of my criminal empire, when I commanded respect from Colombia to Canada and lived like royalty in a tropical paradise built on powder and violence. My primary residence was a $5 million estate on Star Island, with panoramic views of downtown Miami's skyline and enough security to rival the White House. The property included a private dock where my 80-foot yacht, White Lightning, waited like a floating fortress capable of reaching international waters in less than 20 minutes if federal agents came calling. Daily life operated on a schedule that would have impressed corporate executives, if those executives happened to be running multinational criminal enterprises. Morning briefings in my home office covered overnight shipments from suppliers in Medellin, distribution reports from street-level dealers throughout South Florida, and intelligence updates from corrupt officials who kept us informed about law enforcement activities. By 10 a.m., I was typically reviewing financial reports that showed weekly profits exceeding what most legitimate businesses earned annually. My inner circle consisted of specialists recruited from various backgrounds, each bringing skills that kept our operation ahead of law enforcement and rival organizations. Carlos Mendez, my chief of security, was a former Colombian military officer who understood warfare in ways that proved invaluable when territorial disputes erupted. Maria Santos handled our money laundering operations, using an MBA from the University of Miami to create financial structures that transformed drug profits into legitimate investments throughout South Florida real estate markets. The technology we employed was cutting edge for its time, often superior to what law enforcement agencies could afford. Encrypted communication systems that changed frequencies hourly, surveillance equipment that monitored police radio channels throughout Miami-Dade and Broward counties, and even early computer systems that tracked inventory and distribution with the efficiency of major corporations. We invested in lawyers who specialized in constitutional law, accountants who understood offshore banking regulations, and consultants who helped us stay ahead of changing federal enforcement priorities. My personal spending reached levels that seemed almost fictional in retrospect. A single weekend in Las Vegas could cost more than most people's annual salaries, with private jets, penthouse suites, and entertainment that catered to every conceivable excess. I owned art collections that included works by recognized masters, wine cellars that held bottles worth more than luxury cars, and jewelry that required its own security detail when worn in public. The irony wasn't lost on me that a kid from Overtown now owned things that belonged in museums. But paradise built on criminal foundations is inherently unstable, and by 1992, cracks were beginning to show in what I had constructed. Federal task forces were getting more sophisticated, using RICO statutes and asset forfeiture laws that threatened our entire financial structure. Competition from Mexican cartels was intensifying, with organizations that had deeper pockets and fewer scruples about civilian casualties. Most dangerous of all, some of my closest associates were beginning to show signs of strain under constant pressure, making them potential security risks in an environment where trust was the difference between life and death. The isolation that came with absolute power was perhaps the heaviest price I paid during those peak years. Genuine relationships became impossible when everyone around you was either an employee, a business partner, or a potential threat. Romance was complicated by the fact that any woman who entered my life became a target for enemies or a potential intelligence asset for law enforcement. Even family relationships suffered, as my mother lived in constant fear that my lifestyle would bring violence to her doorstep, and my younger siblings learned to pretend they didn't know me when asked about their successful brother. The beginning of the end came on a Tuesday morning in March 1993, when I woke up to find federal agents surrounding my Star Island estate like a military invasion force. DEA helicopters circled overhead while speedboats blocked any escape routes across Biscayne Bay. Through my bedroom window, I watched agents in tactical gear setting up command posts in my own garden, their movements precise and coordinated in ways that told me this wasn't a fishing expedition. They had everything they needed to bring down my entire organization. The indictment, when it was finally unsealed, read like a catalog of my life's work over the previous 7 years. Conspiracy to distribute cocaine, money laundering through dozens of businesses throughout South Florida, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering charges that carried life sentences, and tax evasion on a scale that impressed even the IRS agents who specialized in complex financial crimes. They had recorded phone conversations going back 3 years, surveillance photos that documented meetings I thought were completely private, and financial records that traced money from Colombian suppliers to American bank accounts with frightening precision. What hurt most wasn't the betrayal by associates who had decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors. In the drug business, you expect people to save themselves when the ship starts sinking. What destroyed me was learning that Isabella, the woman I had loved for 5 years and planned to marry, had been working with the FBI for the past 18 months. The intimate conversations we'd shared in bed, the future plans we'd made during romantic weekends in the Keys, the trust I'd placed in her with details about operations that could get people killed, all of it had been recorded and analyzed by agents who now knew me better than I knew myself. The trial lasted 6 months and became a media sensation that turned Miami's federal courthouse into a circus. Reporters from national networks covered every day of testimony, broadcasting details of my operation to audiences fascinated by real-life Miami Vice stories. Former associates testified about murders I'd ordered, accountants explained money laundering schemes using charts that looked like corporate presentations, and prosecutors played recordings of my voice discussing violence with a casual tone other people used to plan dinner parties. My legal team, despite costing more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence federal prosecutors had assembled. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. As the foreman read the verdict, I looked around the courtroom at my mother, who was crying silently in the front row, and realized that everything I had built over the previous decade had been an elaborate form of suicide. Not just physical, but moral and spiritual. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, giving me time to contemplate what life imprisonment would mean for someone who had spent the previous 7 years believing he was invincible. My lawyers filed appeals that we all knew were hopeless, negotiated with prosecutors about cooperation that could reduce my sentence, and helped me prepare for a future that would be measured in decades behind bars rather than years of freedom. The luxury that had defined my adult life would be replaced by a concrete cell and the institutional rhythms of federal prison. During those final weeks of freedom, confined to house arrest in a downtown Miami apartment that felt like a storage closet compared to my former estate, I had time to think clearly for the first time in years. The cocaine that had fueled both my business and my lifestyle was gone, leaving me to face reality without pharmaceutical assistance. The entourage of employees and associates had disappeared, leaving me alone with thoughts I had been avoiding for most of my adult life. For the first time since I was 15 years old, I was forced to confront the question of who Marcus Rodriguez really was when stripped of money, power, and the respect that came from being feared. Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, became my new address in September 1993, and the contrast with my former life was so stark it felt like traveling to another planet. My new home was a 6 by 10-foot cell with concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that never completely turned off, and a view that consisted of razor wire and guard towers instead of Biscayne Bay sunsets. The $3,000 suits were replaced by prison uniforms that smelled like industrial detergent, and the gourmet meals were replaced by institutional food that tasted like cardboard seasoned with disappointment. The first year was the hardest, not because of the physical conditions but because of the complete ego destruction that comes with falling from the top of the criminal food chain to the bottom of the prison hierarchy. Inmates who had read about my trial in newspapers treated me with a mixture of respect and suspicion. Respect for what I had accomplished, suspicion about whether I had cooperated with authorities to get a lighter sentence. Former associates who had arrived at Coleman before me provided conflicting accounts of my conduct during the investigation, leaving me in a social limbo that was almost more isolating than solitary confinement. Depression hit like a physical force during my second year. The appeals had been exhausted, the money was gone to legal fees and asset forfeiture, and the realization that I would likely die in prison became unavoidable. I spent months barely leaving my cell, reading legal books in a desperate search for some procedural error that might provide grounds for a new trial, writing letters to attorneys who stopped returning my calls, and slowly accepting that the life I had known was permanently over. Suicide seemed like a reasonable option during the darkest periods, when the weight of what I had lost felt heavier than the prospect of decades still ahead. The intervention came from an unexpected source: Brother Thomas, a Catholic chaplain who had been ministering to inmates at Coleman for over 20 years. He was a slight man in his 60s who had spent his adult life working with society's most discarded people, and he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. "You're not the first powerful man to end up here," he told me during our first conversation. "But you might be the first one willing to do something meaningful with the time you have left." Brother Thomas introduced me to inmates who had found purpose in prison through education, spiritual growth, and service to others. Men who had committed violent crimes were now teaching literacy classes to younger prisoners. Drug dealers were counseling addicts through recovery programs. Even murderers were finding ways to contribute positively to the prison community, proving that redemption was possible even in the most hopeless circumstances. These men became my teachers, showing me that prison could be a place of transformation rather than just punishment. The spiritual awakening didn't happen overnight. It was more like a slow sunrise after the longest night of my life. I started attending Bible study classes, not because I believed, but because I was curious about what gave these men hope in such hopeless circumstances. I began reading religious texts alongside legal books, comparing different philosophical approaches to questions about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of starting over. Most importantly, I started praying, awkwardly at first, then with increasing desperation as I realized how much help I needed. The breakthrough moment came during my 4th year at Coleman, when I was finally able to write a letter of apology to the mother of a young man who had died from an overdose of cocaine my organization had distributed in Miami. I had been trying to write that letter for 2 years, but every attempt had been filled with justifications, explanations, and excuses that revealed how far I still was from genuine repentance. When I finally wrote a letter that simply said, "I'm sorry, and I was wrong," without any qualifications or explanations, something fundamental shifted inside me. For the first time since my arrest, I cried, not for myself, but for the pain I had caused others. Today, 15 years after my release from federal prison, I wake up every morning in a small apartment in Little Haiti, put on clothes from Walmart instead of designer boutiques, and drive a used Honda Civic to New Hope Community Church, where I serve as assistant pastor for a congregation that averages about 60 people on Sunday mornings. My weekly salary of $400 is less than what I used to spend on lunch during my drug lord days, but I've never felt richer in the ways that actually matter. The transition from prison to freedom was more difficult than I had anticipated. After serving 12 years at Coleman, the world had changed in ways that made me feel like Rip Van Winkle awakening from a decades-long sleep. Cell phones had become computers, the internet had transformed communication, and Miami had evolved into a different city with new buildings where my old haunts used to stand. More challenging than technological changes was learning to live without the identity that had defined me for most of my adult life. I was no longer King Rodriguez, feared drug lord, but just Marcus, a middle-aged ex-convict trying to figure out what legitimate contribution he could make to society. Brother Thomas had maintained correspondence with me throughout my incarceration, and he helped arrange my transition into a halfway house in Orlando, where I lived for 6 months while learning basic skills that most people take for granted. How to open a bank account when your credit history consists entirely of federal crimes. How to interview for jobs when your resume has a 12-year gap that can only be explained by mentioning prison. How to form relationships with people who had never lived outside the law, and who might reasonably be suspicious of someone with my background. My first legitimate job was washing dishes at a Cuban restaurant in Hialeah, earning minimum wage and working 10-hour shifts that left my hands raw and my feet aching. The work was harder than anything I had done during my criminal career, but it was also cleaner in ways that had nothing to do with soap and hot water. Every dollar I earned came from honest labor. Every interaction with coworkers was based on genuine human connection rather than fear or manipulation, and every day ended with the satisfaction of knowing I had contributed something positive to the world instead of just taking from it. The call to ministry developed gradually through volunteer work with prison outreach programs and addiction recovery centers throughout South Florida. My background, which made me unemployable in many industries, was actually valuable in working with people who had made similar choices and were looking for proof that change was possible. I could speak to current and former inmates in ways that conventional counselors couldn't, sharing specific experiences about the psychological and spiritual challenges of leaving criminal lifestyles behind. Seminary training at a small Baptist college in Miami prepared me for formal pastoral work, but my real education had come from years of making mistakes and learning to live with their consequences. New Hope Community Church sits in a converted warehouse in a neighborhood where most residents are struggling economically, many are dealing with addiction or criminal histories, and everyone understands what it means to need second chances. Our congregation includes former drug dealers, recovering addicts, single mothers working multiple jobs, elderly immigrants who speak limited English, and teenagers trying to avoid the mistakes their parents made. Sunday services are conducted in both English and Creole, and our communion table welcomes anyone seeking forgiveness and transformation, regardless of their past. My personal life is simple in ways that would have seemed impossible during my years as a drug lord. I live in a one-bedroom apartment with furniture from thrift stores, drive a car with 150,000 miles on the odometer, and eat meals that cost less than the tips I used to leave at expensive restaurants. But I also sleep peacefully without worrying about assassination attempts, maintain relationships based on genuine affection rather than fear, and wake up each morning knowing that my work contributes to healing rather than harm. The $50 million I made as a criminal is gone, seized by federal agents and distributed to victims of my crimes, but I've discovered wealth that can't be measured in bank account balances. The young men I counsel now remind me of who I was at their age: intelligent, ambitious, and convinced that criminal success represents freedom rather than just another form of slavery. When I tell them my story, I don't glorify the wealth and power I once possessed, but I also don't pretend that choosing a different path is easy when you're surrounded by poverty and limited legitimate opportunities. What I can offer them is proof that change is possible, that past mistakes don't have to define future possibilities, and that sometimes losing everything is the first step toward finding what actually matters. Every dollar I don't earn as a minimum wage pastor is worth more than every million I accumulated as a drug lord, because it comes from work that builds up rather than tears down, that heals rather than destroys, and that serves God rather than just serving myself.